Hi, Nick Ritter here. Welcome back for another Cavalry tutorial. If you have experience in After Effects and are trying to pick up Cavalry, this tutorial is for you. This will be different from a lot of my other tutorials. We're not going to go through a project step by step, but we will end up going through the interface. So I've got After Effects here on the left and Cavalry here on the right. After Effects is a fantastic motion graphics tool. It also does visual effects. It has some 3D capabilities. It's a very well-rounded piece of software. Cavalry, at the moment, is still focused entirely on 2D motion graphics. You're not going to be doing any visual effects in here. You're not going to be doing 3D motion graphics here. It's just 2D motion graphics. Both After Effects and Cavalry have a project/asset window. So this is where you import things, import assets. This is where you create your compositions. Lots of similarities between the two. The biggest difference with this window, in Cavalry, you can create a folder structure. So if you click over on this project description, this project I have connected to my Cavalry Tuts files folder that I put all of my YouTube tutorials in. And you can set or create a new path by looking in your file browser and finding a folder that you want to house the project in. So this will import all of your assets, it'll save all of your renders, save your scenes, auto saves, all of that lives right in here. And if you're wondering, after I created the Cavalry project, I created this folder in which this After Effects project is saved. We also have a viewport. In After Effects, it's called a composition window. The timeline between the two programs does look a little bit different and actually plays quite a bit different when we've got some layers in there. I'll delete this one. So let's create a couple. We've got our text. There's a shape. There's another shape. And let's create a arrow shape as well. But let me create some similar things over here in After Effects. Okay, there's a shape. Let's create a star one. Okay, I'll create a circle. And then let's create some text. When I create shapes in After Effects or text or any other layer, there's this little menu arrow that you can twirl down to look at your different options. You can change your transform properties, your effects, your shape properties, whatever. Cavalry has the same thing, and to get there, you double click on a layer and go to your attribute editor. Now you'll see that everything that we created is automatically here. So let me clear that. And each layer that you double click on will just add it to the stack. And then you can choose to only open the options for one layer by holding Alt or Option and double clicking. And if you'd like, you can still close the menu. Instead of deep menus, where you go in layers and layers deep, in Cavalry, it's organized by tabs. So here's all of our stroke options, here's all of our mask options, fill, shape, and that's for these arrows. After Effects shape layers are groups by default. So if I click this layer, which has the rectangle in it, and let's go ahead and hide the rest of these. If I click this shape layer with the rectangle in it, and I create another shape, it appears in that same shape layer. Cavalry, it does create a new layer for each shape. However, to group things, you select the shapes that you want, hold down Control or Command and G, and that groups the layers. You can group any kind of layers that you want, including groups. So I'll click this text shape, the rectangle, and our group. Control G, and now we have a new group. We can twirl it down, and the groups themselves even have their own options. Or you can animate transformation properties, opacity even of all the items within the group, change the blend mode. In After Effects, to turn on motion blur, each layer has its own checkbox. And then of course you can turn it off for the entire composition right here. In Cavalry, each layer does have motion blur capabilities, but you need to double click and then check the motion blur checkbox right here. Then additionally, you'll want to turn on the motion blur for that composition. Your motion blur settings in After Effects are found when you do Command or Control K. In fact, that's all of your composition settings, where you can set the frame rate, duration, width, height, aspect ratio, motion blur settings. In Cavalry, the settings lie right here, and so it's just a pop-up that goes away when you click away from it, or you can choose to detach, and it's its own window now. And you can keep this window open while you're using the rest of the app. And it's got the same sorts of options, including our motion blur samples, our shutter angle, and it's got a few other options that you may not have seen before. After Effects does have some ways to organize your layers. Many of those are using other plugins or scripts, and you can always change the color of your layers. So then you can select all with a certain label group and visually get an idea of your project structure. Over in Cavalry, you can also change the color of your layers. There's also this tag window where you can select items based on element type, based on color, or you can click this tag icon over here and create your own. You just click and drag the layer into your custom tag. When you click on each of these tags, the view is filtered down to what's in that tag. So think of it like the shy icon, and it's a little more advanced, a little more customizable, and a little more complex to use than the shy guy button. In After Effects, to animate anything, you look for the property that you want to animate. In this case, we'll go transform and position, click on the stopwatch, sets our first keyframe at wherever the playhead is. We'll move ahead a couple of seconds, select the selection tool, and move it to another spot. And now we have an animation. In Cavalry, works much the same way. So let's delete all of this and create another rectangle. Inside our rectangle attributes, when you hover over each item, you'll see that there's a little keyframe button here. So you can click it to animate only one side of the attribute. You can hold down Alt or Option and click to animate both of them. And it creates those keyframes at our playhead. So I'll send those to the beginning, move forward a little bit, and let's click our square and move it. Now we have animation. And you'll notice in Cavalry, when we animate or create keyframes, those animated attributes show up in our composition window, and we can manipulate the keyframes right here. You can manipulate both the keyframes by selecting the line in the middle, and the keyboard shortcut to nudge is the plus and minus buttons. You can also double click on a keyframe to edit right next to the keyframe. You can close up these options just by clicking this arrow here. And then if you want to see everything with keyframes in it again, you just click this little circle and it opens them right up. To open the graph editor in After Effects, you just click this graph editor button, and then depending on what you have selected, you can see and change the interpolation of those keyframes. And then of course, if you're in the correct view, you can customize the velocity of said keyframes. We can just make this a little snappier. In Cavalry, works much the same way. So let's select both of the items that we want to use in the graph editor, click on this graph editor button down at the bottom. So use your scroll wheel to zoom in and out. You can hold down Shift to zoom just horizontally. And then you can hold down Alt to zoom in vertically. And then of course you can change the interpolation right here. So let's set this to Bezier, and then let's even set these to Bezier as well. So in After Effects, when you select multiple keyframes and you change the influence or the speed of one of these handles, it just changes that one handle even though you have both of them selected. In Cavalry, when you select multiple, it does change all of them that you have selected, but you'll notice that Cavalry is smart enough to determine which way you would want to pull that handle. So even though I'm pulling this one left to go steeper, you'll see that the other handles are going the opposite direction. Also, After Effects gives you the option to look at your value graph or your speed graph, and in Cavalry, you're just looking at your value graph. Additionally, we know that you can add overshoot and bounce and spring capabilities using expressions on many of the parameters within After Effects. Over in Cavalry, they don't have expressions, but what you can do is I'll just select this position X, can select both of our keyframes, go to Magic Easing. This gives us a lot of different options to automate some of these things. So we can do spring out, just like this, and it creates that line for us in the graph. And let's take a look at bounce as well. I'm going to take a second in the middle of this video here. Thank you so much for watching this. Don't forget to drop a comment, like, and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one. I really appreciate it. Okay, back to the video. Let's take a look at some of the different panels in After Effects and their equivalents in Cavalry. In After Effects, we have our Effects and Presets panel where you can click and search for whatever you want. Many of you may already have the Video Copilot shortcut, so when you have a layer selected, you can quickly type out the effects that you want. And in Cavalry, it looks a lot like the Video Copilot extension. So let's create a square here. In this case, it's Control or Command, period. And then you can immediately start typing in what you want. So in After Effects, let's go ahead and add a turbulent displace. And we can see the effects of it right away. Change all of our parameters here in the effect controls. So how do we do this effect over in Cavalry? Well, we have our rectangle shape selected. I'll make that a little bit bigger. So if you hold down Alt or Option, you can change multiple parameters at the same time if they're connected, such as width and height are both part of size, and so you can change those at the same time. In each layer, there's a deformers option, so you can hit plus, and instead of turbulent displace, it's called noise. Noise actually shows up as its own layer. I'll get more into that in just a second. So with our noise, we can change all of our parameters here, change our maximum and our minimum, but it doesn't quite look the same as our After Effects shape. What's going on? Well, in Cavalry, our procedural shapes have what's called edge divisions. This determines the resolution of the shape. I'll show you what I mean. Let's change this to 2. You'll see that there's 2 extra points in the middle of each side that is now affected by our noise. So the more we turn it up, the more edges there are, the higher definition our shape deformation will be. So if I set this to 25 and this to 25, now we have a pretty good looking shape. In fact, let's even go up to 50. And so now we can just adjust our parameters and maybe even the frequency, so it starts to look a lot like our shape in After Effects. Now the thing with After Effects, with having an effect and just changing those single parameters, is that say we have another shape and I want to use the exact same effect on it. We can select this effect, come into Edit, copy with property links, and then come over to this layer and paste it. Or the manual way is to simply copy and paste our effect, and then you have to go through on each effect and connect it via expressions and the pick whip to our other effect. It takes a few different steps to get there. The effect works pretty well, although After Effects does slow down the more expressions you have. Cavalry, it's a little simpler because the effect is its own layer. It's not just attached to this rectangle shape layer. So if I create another rectangle shape, let's move it up here, and then again, change our edge divisions. Now you can connect this layer into our rectangle shape using this blue dot here. And every single layer and every single parameter has this blue dot. So you just click and drag, and then it tells you all of the things that you can connect that noise to. So you can connect that noise effect to position, rotation, etc. But in this case, I'm going to go up here to the deformers and connect to new index. Now we have the exact same noise connected to both shapes. So as I change the maximum here, it changes the maximum in both places. And here's another cool thing. When you create these effects using the deformers drop-down button here, it automatically makes that effect a child of the layer that you're applying it to. But it doesn't have to be a child. We can unparent it, and it works just the same. The noise is still there. And then you can always go in and see what is connected to what by clicking on these arrows. So this noise is going into our rectangle shape 5 and our rectangle shape 6 under deformers for both. You can click the yellow arrow to see what things are connected into this layer. And then Cavalry even takes it one step further. In the attribute editor, you can click on this button here to take a look at the actual nodes and see that, oh, this noise, it's a simplex noise and it's connected straight into this rectangle shape. And you can even connect the noise to multiple parameters. So let's go ahead and connect this into rotation as well. So now when I click and drag my rectangle 6, the rotation changes based on the noise. And it also has this deformer here that deforms the shape based on the noise. Pretty cool. Now this leads us to the biggest difference between After Effects and Cavalry. In After Effects you have layers with effects on them. In Cavalry you have layers and some of them are effects. We call these elements. And when we click Control period, you can see all of the items that can act as deformers or as behaviors or as filters. So here's the blur filter. The big idea is that everything connects to everything. When I first started using Cavalry, and even now still, it can feel a little messy to have all of these extra layers in here, even though you're not necessarily seeing them. Like this noise isn't its own visible layer. If I make these other rectangles invisible, you don't see anything with it. So it's like, why is that even there? But it's there because it's its own entity. It affects other visual layers. On this rectangle shape 5, let's go ahead and add a blur. So under filters, there's a blur filter. So when we open this blur filter, we have one parameter here and we can just change the amount. And now we can even connect that blur filter to our other shape if we want. Now we have that one filter working on both shapes. And when I delete this, you'll see that the filter goes off both of them at the same time. The next panel we have is our align panel. There's something very similar to that here in Cavalry. And Cavalry actually takes the align a couple steps further. And I'll just give you a little teaser. Normally the way this works is if you create a shape and you duplicate. Let's take this very last one and I'll move it over all the way aside like this. Select all my layers and then distribute them equally between each other. And then we can make them all line up on the top or in the middle or on the bottom. Distribute between each other. And that's how aligning really works in After Effects. There's some fancy stuff you can do with expressions. In Cavalry, let's go ahead and create this rectangle shape here. And then we'll duplicate. Select our last layer and drag that all the way over to the right. Select all of them. And then do our distribution. And then the alignment tools work the same. We can select all of these and then just make sure they're aligned, distributed. Another way to accomplish this same look here is when you click on the layer that you want to have duplicates of, you hold down Alt or Option and you click on this little duplicator button up here. So when you click that, it creates a duplicator. It's automatically set to grid, but you can change that to linear, set the count to 4, and then increase the size. And then you can do cool things like taking the shape time offset, right-clicking, adding a behavior. Let's add a stagger behavior to that, and then animate our shape position, create the first keyframe there, and the second keyframe here. Set the stagger offset. Now when we animate it, we can see it staggers all of the elements animation. And we can do this with a duplicator. Another way to align is within our deformers, hit the plus button. There's this align element that we can add. And the align element here can change our pivot position. Another thing you can do is add what's called a constraint. I go more over this in my constraint videos. And let's just add a composition constraint. We'll connect that in with our position. Then we can procedurally align this shape based on the width of our composition. So if we set this to 11% here and say 66% there, and then we change the resolution of our timeline, it'll maintain those percentages even though the resolution is changing. Let's take a look at our text panels here. So we have our paragraph and our character. If you're ever trying to find a panel, you can come up here to Window, and then this shows you all of your panels, including a few extra things like animation utilities. So you can reverse the animation, and you can bake your keyframes, so forth. Even in here, there's no text panels. But let's go ahead and create a text layer. And to create the layer, I hold down Alt or Option and then click any of these tools. And then it just creates a default shape right in the center. So here in the text layer, we have our options that you would find in paragraph or character. So you can change your font, you can change your weight. You can even have a procedural typeface that you pull from a spreadsheet somewhere. And the next version that's coming out also has tracking. And then of course you can change the fill color here, and you can add a stroke if you'd like as well. And just as a fun demo, let's change this to black and then make that font size pretty big. Cavalry sees text as vector shapes, and I'll show you what I mean. Let's change this font to Kenny Blocks. Kenny Blocks is a very angular, squared off font. It works on any font. Under deformers, you can add the bevel deformer, and that looks at each point and it turns it into a curve. So we can open up the bevel and change this from fillet to chamfer if we want, and then change our radius right here. So procedurally, it does treat the text as vector shapes. Let's look at the color wheel and library palettes down here. Cavalry's color palette works a lot like the Ray Dynamic Color 2 from AE Scripts. It also works similar to the library panel, where you can store a color palette and then use that to color your shapes and your text and whatever else. I'll demo that real quick. This rectangle shape. So in this case, I'll use this bright palette. It's one of the presets here. So we'll drag this down so it's in our scene palette. What I can do is I can hover over here, find this blue circle, click and drag to connect it to our rectangle shape, enter fill color, and there it is. When we have a stroke, we can also set up one of these colors to be on our stroke. If there's any effects that take color parameters, you can connect those as well. The other thing that these color palettes can do is if I create a grid of these shapes, so let's increase the size here. So if I create a grid of these shapes, and I'll even show this, so you can even show your scene palette in the attribute editor. I can connect this whole scene palette using this circle here into our rectangle shape. Okay, let's cut that connection. We can connect the whole scene palette using this blue circle right here into our rectangle shape, fill color, and then it automatically distributes those colors on our grid with our duplicator. And then of course you can double click on any of these colors and say the client does not like red anymore, they'd rather have green. Then you can just drag this over and it changes the green out here. The last thing we'll take a look at is rendering. So once you have an animation, in After Effects you have a render queue. You can add to render queue like this. In Cavalry, just create a shape real quick. You can get there by hitting Control or Command B, or you can go up to the File menu and go to Render Manager. The Render Manager can render out multiple compositions at the same time. You can change the format here, make the render dynamic here. There's more tutorials about that. Set up all the compositions that you're rendering here. And then of course change the output settings if you're using GPU or CPU. And then if you set up your folder structure correctly, it should automatically set up your file path for you. You can even click to add the current composition. I'm going to render out PNG sequence, and the second one I'll render out a QuickTime movie. And then you just click Render Queue, and it'll render both of them out. When you render out things with the render manager, it does freeze up the interface. So we'll close out of that. Let me know if you have any additional questions down below. I'm thinking I might make this more of a series where we take a look at how to replicate some of the techniques from After Effects into Cavalry. Let me know below if that's something you'd be interested in. Again, don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this, and thank you.